Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew Hall. I'm the CEO of the Insurance Council and would like to thank you for joining us today. This is the first time we are testing a industry-wide briefing, and so we really appreciate your time and your patience as we get this set up. We're coming to you from the ICA offices here, which is in Sydney. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we broadcast from today and pay our respects to elders past and present. I'm joined today here with Nat Simpson, who is the CEO of UE Insurance, and Christine Stasi, who is the Group Executive of People, Performance and Reputation at IAG. Nat and Christine were the co-chairs of a delegation which, together with the AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce, and the ICA, we've just completed a visit to the United States. And we're taking the opportunity today to brief the industry on what were the key findings we had coming out of that visit to the US. We're going to cover off a range of topics that came up across that whole period and dive into them for the relevance for what we can learn here in the Australian market across a broad range of insurance sectors that we cover. We've already had a very busy week this week, though. As some of you know, we released our annual catastrophe and resilience report for 23-24. That highlighted again the industry paid out around $2.1 billion in payments associated with catastrophe, declared catastrophes. But we also had a look back to see what the impact of extreme weather is doing in terms of the Australian economy and on insurance. And of course, as we know, those impacts are increasing. It's taking up more and more of our GDP, and it's having an effect on all Australians. So for that reason, we've been doing a lot of engagement still with the federal and state governments around the country, because we know that a partnership with government is clearly the only way forward to deal with some of these areas of more extreme weather exposure and availability and affordability. We're also being very keen to understand what's happening around the world. This is a global issue. It's not just an Australian problem. So for that reason, we made the decision to set up the US delegation. And in having the conversation with AmCham, we quickly realized there were a lot of similarities between the US and the Australian markets. Like Australia, the United States has a rapidly growing population. It's grown in areas that are very nice and pleasant to live in along the coast, in states familiar to many Australians like California, Florida, Louisiana, and the like. But at the same time, those areas have also been suffering from insurance affordability and availability issues. And in the United States, they have tried a number of different private-public partnerships. They've done a number of market interventions and the like. Some of them have an interesting effect. Others have effects that we probably wouldn't want to replicate here in Australia. So for that reason, we thought it was critically important to have discussions with policymakers, with insurers, with regulators and the like, to understand what were those key lessons. While we were in California, we had the opportunity to hold a landmark wildfire and flood summit. That's where we brought together our delegation with a range of experts in California, both from insurers, academia, government and government agencies, to talk about the various approaches that each country has been taking in dealing with both wildfire and flood. Of course, in America, we use the term wildfire. Here in Australia, we know it more colloquially as our bushfire. Again, to cut to the chase, the answer to the whole question, as always, is reduce the risk. Unless we deal with resilience and mitigation measures, the risk only continues to increase. And the trajectory we are on suggests that that's not going to change. So all of our jurisdictions are faced with some really significant challenges. And they're very big questions of both public policy, but also commercial decisioning by insurers. And the two work together very closely. So in Australia, we know that in the last few years, we've worked very closely with our policymakers around trying to find solutions. When the federal government came to power 2 years ago, we got a commitment from them to invest around $2 billion in disaster-ready funding. We are working through the Hazards Insurance Partnership with government and their agencies, trying to leverage the best possible data we can from insurers to inform government investment and spending. And I want to say thank you to those insurers and a number of people online today who have been working very hard to support the ICA and support the government in trying to achieve both of those outcomes. But it's clear we have to redouble our efforts. I often feel like a broken record. I could go on and on about this all day long, but what I'm going to do, though, is bring in our co-leads of our delegation, let them say a few words about what we found on the trip, and then we might dive into some of the discussions. So I might hand over Christine and let you say a few words.
Good morning, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Well, it truly was an incredible study tour in terms of learning. I think it's fair to say that the Australia-United States relationship really holds immense significance for us as a country. And insurance really does transcend across many borders. We've got so many things in common, particularly with California, which I think we'll explore later on this morning. Whether it be through cyber attacks, changes in extreme weather conditions, and then how customers, government and insurers face into it. I think they're all very common issues that we're all facing. One of my biggest learnings is exactly what Andrew said. Risk mitigation really is the key. I think it is the long-term sustainable way that we can drive down renewals and the cost of insurance. And the other big aha moment for me was the reduction in protection and the increase in premiums really is not an Australian exclusive environment. It's something it's a phenomena that's happening globally. And it was interesting to hear from many different organisations, industry, as well as government around how they tackled it in America. And I think for us, lots of lessons to learn from too.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll agree with Christine on all of those regards. The challenges that we face in this market, they are generally universal.
Yeah.
The only treatment for them is to actually address the root cause, which is we've got to bring down the risk to make insurance more available and affordable. So many of the constructs that we saw in how the markets operate in the US makes me incredibly grateful for how things work here, where we don't have this sort of federal state standoffs. And you can just see it playing out in real time again with what's happening with Hurricane Debbie in the US. And we'll talk a little bit more about the National Flood Insurance Program in the US. But I mean, Hurricane Debbie, I saw some stats. 3/4 of the buildings that have been destroyed through that hurricane are outside of the compulsory insurance zones. So that just shows how the risk is constantly moving, and the only way to really solve for this is that investment into mitigation. And I think the insurance industry plays a critical role in being able to send those risk signals, and that interfaces with what Andrew was saying in that hazards insurance partnership being so important, that we can use data to drive effective action. So yeah.
Well, that's a really good point, Nat. So we might dive into some of those themes we really did touch on during the study tour. Of course, it was an interesting time to be in the US. We were there the week that Joe Biden announced he wasn't contesting the upcoming election. We endured the CrowdStrike impact, and the opportunity will come to that, the cyber effects. And even when we were in Washington, we had all the troubles of the world arriving on our doorstep. So we had to work through quite a few issues, but we were very grateful for the time that people did give us there. And we really got to meet with some really key people. So I thought what we should do is we'll cover off on the state of the property and casualty market in the US. We'll talk about your point just then about the flood insurance issues and that public-private interface in the US and what we can learn from that. The resilience investment piece, innovation, because we did end the tour in Silicon Valley, and then the ongoing political climate, which obviously does have an impact on all of that. So The protection gap, it's a big issue not only in Australia but around the world, and we see a lot of studies. I think Swiss Re produced probably the most comprehensive global study on this all the time, and even some of the most advanced insurance markets, we see protection gaps of near on 50%, which suggests that one of our key weapons of defence, I guess, in a more extreme weather future, which is insurance, needs to be enhanced and focused on. So I think, Christine, thinking about the US market and what we saw there, what do you think some of the key issues were that are coming out of that market, and particularly in areas perhaps like Florida?
Yeah, so Florida was a really interesting case study, Andrew. A few thematics around Florida. So they've had a significant population increase of about 1.2 million over the last 5 years. They have faced 5 of the 10 most costly hurricanes in the country in the last decade or so, and rising insurance, about 33% year on year for the last couple of years. And what's happened there is we're seeing where the industry is literally pulling out because of a number of multi-factors that are impacting it on an annual basis. So we've seen an increase in the cost to build, the cost to rebuild, labour shortages, and the protection gap is really not meeting or being able to fund the needs of the Florida people. In addition to that, what's quite interesting is despite its population, 7 or 8% of total population in the US, it represents something like 75% of all litigation against insurers. So there's a really big disconnect, I think, around consumers understanding what they are insured for, how much they're insured for, and then when it'll actually trigger, as well as insurers' ability to provide cover when people need it. We heard from some insurers who are saying they're pulling out of the market because they just can't price the risk appropriately and price it at a time that's reflective of what their data and research says also. So it was an extremely interesting to hear from people around Florida in terms of protection gaps not quite working, but also the rapid change in the impact of climate and the insurer's ability to meet the demand as well as price the risk. Yeah.
And in both Florida and California, I remember there was a term that was used quite a bit about legal abuse. And I thought that was an interesting concept, which we can touch on a little bit later. Nat, we then obviously travelled to California, Sacramento, the state capital. What were the things that we picked up while we were in California?
Yeah, a couple of things. And maybe the first thing is a bit of a parallel to what's going on in Florida. So because there are these sort of backstops, you see lots of large populations moving to quite natural hazard exposed areas. California, I mean, it's got pretty much all the natural perils that you can think of: wildfire, floods, earthquake, and we spent a bit of time with the California Earthquake Authority, which was a really enlightening session. So I mean, lots of parallels in California to Florida. Being in Silicon Valley, the topic of cyber exposure, cyber insurance kept coming up as well.
Yeah.
We did have a bit of that sort of similar conversation in DC, where I think, quoting Trump, he talks about the US being the insurance policy for the world when it comes to war. And cyber's a real risk in that regard. So I mean, California's pretty much got an ensemble of all of the issues that need to be navigated, and that's really being reflected in the prices that are needing to be charged for the cover provided. Home insurance prices have gone sort of up 33% in the last year. I just saw some media yesterday of motor insurance premiums going up 50% in California. I mean, 50% in a year. And staggering.
And what are the drivers? I think we heard some of the drivers of that, which we're experiencing the same sort of trouble here in California around motor insurance.
Yeah, motor insurance largely, I mean, in the US, there's similar challenges to what we're experiencing here. the delays in supply chains to get parts, the shortage of labor to do repairs, or to put new parts on a motor vehicle. So I mean, it's absolutely the same sort of supply chain challenges we're grappling with, labor inflation. I mean, it's all of those compounded by the increasing frequency in aggregate, as well as because of natural perils. So I mean, it's a bit of a melting pot of all of the things coming together simultaneously.
Although we got to spend some time with Commissioner Ricardo Lara, and I think California is a very interesting case study that we can learn from, in terms of you set something up with one intent and the downstream consequences look very different. So the Commissioner in California, which I thought was quite unique, has the ability, or needs to approve every premium claim.
And he's elected.
And he's elected. He's one of
politician.
4 or 5 elected roles in California.
Imagine having, well, I mean, we have a minister here, but imagine having your regulator, the head of ASIC and APRA combined,
Exactly.
also getting elected separately from the government. Yeah.
Well, that's spot on. And his department's there not only to regulate the industry, but also to protect consumers. And what's interesting is, so Commissioner Lara is the one that approves all insurance premium increases. There's a cap on an annual basis around what those premium increases look like. And while the intent was there, with 1,600 insurers and over 500,000 agents, there is a massive backlog. And over the last 8-10 years, they haven't managed to keep up with the application of premium increases. They've been delayed by 18 to 24 months. So at the time an insurer tries to price the risk and it gets approved 2 years later, it's too late.
And the outcome of that we saw was that insurers have ceased writing new policies.
Yeah, that's right.
So we're seeing whole housing estates struggling to be able to find insurance.
That's right.
That isn't there's prohibitions around how you're able to price even your premium.
Yep, like allowing for the cost of reinsurance in the premium you charge to consumers. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting constructs that were probably appropriate at a point in time, but as things play out, it's very, very difficult if you legislate all of those things to keep things fit for purpose. And because of all of this sort of exit of capacity, I think it was Geico. I think it was Geico have now closed all of their state offices in California.
Yeah, that's right.
Which then has all sorts of other flow-on effects. Lots of people lose their jobs and exit the market, and that also then has a knock-on effect on the economy. So, I mean, again, it sort of just highlights the critical role that insurance plays as part of a larger economy. It protects people. People wouldn't be able to finance assets if they couldn't get insurance. So I mean, you have to have a competitive, sustainable insurance marketplace to look after customer needs in the long run. So, yeah.
And in fact, we spoke to one insurer who was pulling out of the California market altogether. And they just said, we just simply can't operate in that environment, which I thought was very interesting given the size of the market. But the other thing that made California quite interesting, and I think very complex for the customer, as well as insurers, is you have to buy separate policies for different cover. So effectively, you may own a home and have 4 or 5 policies on the same home for different coverage.
Yeah.
So when that was being shared, you reflect on it and you think, how do you navigate that as a consumer?
And I think one of the lessons or the learnings, often as Australians, when we travel overseas and to like similar economies, you just assume everything is the same.
Yeah.
And I think what was eye-opening for the delegates, including politicians and policymakers on the trip, was that in the US, their policies, their home policies, their building policies are not really, they're based around, let's call it your normal risks.
Yes.
Your secondary perils of what could happen are generally not covered. And if they are, it's a cash settlement.
Yep.
We heard a lot about the cash settlement situation in the US.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's 3 very salient points that come up through that. The first is as Christine was saying, I mean, you may need to source flood cover separately from earthquake cover, separately from everything else. That doesn't feel like a great experience from a customer's point of view. Then when you go into the cash settlement piece, I mean, in Australia, we pride ourselves on being able to look after our customers and help them navigate that incredibly stressful experience of having to go and rebuild your house or have your car repaired. So I mean, I think that's a value add that we have that just doesn't exist in that market, where the vast majority of claims are just cash settled. And we heard about several instances of sort of fly-by-night operations being spun up.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Lots of consumers being cash settled, contracting to these fly-by-night, and then next thing they just vanish from the market and the customer's out of pocket, and the insurers passed over the money, and then the consumer is taken advantage of. So it just highlights the perils of that as a process. So I mean, I think that's critically important. And I think another that came in is just the extent of the excesses that applied.
Yeah.
I mean, in Australia, it's very uncommon for a home insurance policy to have an excess of, call it 5,000 Aussie dollars. In the US, some of those excesses are a percentage of sum insured, 10 or 15% of your sum insured as an excess. It's huge risk that the consumer has to carry for themselves. So
yeah, and I think that was actually a bit of a shock when people thought about $1 million, policy you might have on a home, and $100,000 is a deductible immediately to be able to make that cover viable. I think that's a good segue to one of the meetings we had in Washington, which was with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. FEMA is the US version of our NEMA. While our NEMA is much younger and is still evolving, FEMA definitely has been around for a long time and certainly captured world headlines. Things like the hurricane that went through New Orleans and the like. Interestingly, FEMA is the agency which runs the National Flood Insurance Program, which is the primary provider of flood insurance in the United States. So it's a scheme that was established in around, I think, 1968. And since its inception, it's been evolved and mandated and changed. And I think this is also one of the lessons, is that when these, I guess, interventions into the market are made, that they don't necessarily contemplate what future governments may then change or do to the mechanism and the like. And I know we were pretty gobsmacked with how the program is running these days, and if you had choices, what you would do. But I think, Christine, we did hear from the insurers as well as FEMA about the program. What were your key takeaways about how flood insurance is operating in the US?
Yeah, so I think one of the big ones is what I'd said earlier on. So the worsening protection gap and the rising pressure on premiums, it really is not in Australia. It's not unique to us in Australia. It's global and it's a phenomenon. Government intervention is really interesting because I think the intent is set up with several outcomes, and then once it actually comes into play, the downstream impact and effects look very, very different. And we heard FEMA say on a number of occasions it's wiped out literally billions and billions of dollars of debt. I think it could have been 18 billion. It's now in $20 billion debt because it can't keep up with the risk. But if there's one big takeout out of the FEMA discussion was very interesting, and I think does transcend and apply to us, is that mitigating underlying risk really is the most effective way for us to achieve sustainable premium reductions.
Yep.
But that, I think, needs to take an all systems approach. It's government working with industry, working with consumers and customers. It's about us being really thoughtful around our building standards, our land use planning, and then what's the best opportunity for us to really build sustainable, resilient communities when you integrate all of those factors together. And I don't think it can be done alone. And we've seen protection and the protection gap and what FEMA was set out to do in the late 60s and where they're at now. And it hasn't quite delivered. And the cost of it, as you said, is extraordinary in terms of people's ability even to access the fund. So, yeah.
I mean, is it at a point, can the US ever have a private flood market? Or is it baked in now that this is all just sheeted home to the taxpayer, I guess?
Yeah, Andrew, I mean, that's a great question. And I think the thing that always stuck out for me is this, nothing more permanent than a temporary shed. And that's a little bit of what we're dealing with here. Because it was never intended to be a long-term solution. Right. And I think that's evident in the fact that it was supposed to be sort of, I can't remember exactly the legislative construct, but it's sort of approved for 5-year stints in a row. I think they stopped doing that at a point, and I think it's 18 one-year extensions that they've had concurrently.
Well, no one will ever be politically game to get rid of it. It becomes very hard to.
And in the and no private markets, and FEMA said this themselves, that no private markets can exist when they're competing with FEMA, because they are nowhere near charging the price to reflect the risk, which is why they had a $18 billion write-off, and there are $20 billion still in the hole. So I think it's incredibly difficult for a private market to exist in competition with a heavily government subsidized insurer. And they themselves, I was very surprised at the level of candor, how they said they also don't want to be in this position, but the legislative constructs, in essence, preclude them from being able to move their pricing up in order to create a sustainable, competitive landscape. So I think there's a lot of takeaways for us in that regard, and making sure that we can learn from the school fees of others. I think that would be good.
And I think it would be fair to say that there were a number of people who privately said to us if they could take that 37 or 8 billion US dollars of written off money for this scheme and do something else with it, it would have looked very different. It would have looked more permanent and had a long-lasting effect.
And they talked a lot about the ratio of, for every dollar invested in mitigation, $6 to $7 of savings in future events. So if they took that, sort of call it nearly $40 billion odd dollars, and had invested that into mitigation and addressing the root cause, it would have saved the taxpayer in the US hundreds of billions of dollars. So I think that just shows how the importance of this whole systems thinking, getting government, insurers, regulators, everybody to work together and sort of solve this really tricky problem at all levels.
And it's also about understanding what this risk mitigation cost will deliver at the end, which I do think it's an all systems approach, but it's also, I think, bringing together community, customer, industry and government to say, here's what we're facing into. We know it's going to happen. Our flood maps, for example, tell us it's a prediction that will happen within this time frame. What do we know? What can we learn from? How do we mitigate this risk in a way that means upfront investment to address some very, I think, well-defined and anticipated catastrophes that we're going to face. So it was very interesting to hear the importance of risk mitigation in the investment, and I think it's very similar for us too.
And well, similar, and it was interesting in California where they talked about the challenge of the Californian bungalow that was built post-war, and we were able to thank them for that export, because here in this country we have a lot of aging homes that were built as well to a different standard and are now costing a lot of money to uplift and make resilient to the current environment they're in. And so again, I think it's fair to say across the property market in particular, but motor as well, we saw all the very similar pressures and strains. But ultimately, every intervention that is made only defers pain, and that pain becomes worse unless you're reducing the risk. That's effectively what what we could see happening. And now now it feels like they've they've had an amazing Christmas feast, but now they've got to go to the gym to get fit. Like I do feel for them. They've got a long way to go, but I think we must continue to keep working together on all of that. Now we will be opening up for questions, so I'll give you some instructions on that shortly. But we might move to our next section now, which was around catastrophe response and moving on to innovation, underwriting, and new opportunities.
Yeah.
So we did head, as I mentioned before, and touched on it, to Silicon Valley at the end of the trip. We thought it was important, being so close to the global hub of innovation, that we took the delegation to Silicon Valley. And we did have the opportunity to hear a number of startup organizations within the umbrella of a major innovation hub, Plug and Play, to be able to come and talk to us about what they're doing. It's an overused term, but the future is exciting. Your mind starts opening up to what we're going to be able to see and do and the like. It's also daunting. I think that morning we had in the Eisenhower building next to the White House with the director of cybersecurity for the American government was one of those moments post-CrowdStrike where we thought what the world can really look like when it's impacted by technology coming down. So it was a salient visit. Christine, in San Francisco, did you take a ride in a Waymo car, a driverless Uber, that are now on the streets of California and are moving around and are clearly getting insurance?
Andrew, the power of research and your network, the short answer to that was absolutely no.
You didn't?
No, I did not. But the driverless car, so one thing that I think is really clear, certainly after that Plug and Play and from the network, is driverless cars, I don't think, are as imminent as media or manufacturers are saying. And in fact, in California, we at IAG, we'd read a study and discussed it, that it's actually quite complex to get the laid algorithm right of really structured road rules as well as human behaviour, and have them at such a micro level of interaction and response that they are driverless and safe.
Yeah.
And so in California, the number of fatalities has really meant, I think, that part of the industry has slowed right down, if not a park break, in terms of what's happening. But what we did hear that was interesting is around EVs. And I think the same can be true around what's happening in California and what they're experiencing in EVs as we are. So they're at about 7% of the entire motor market. That's EV compared to our one and a bit.
That was overall, but I think overall, in California it was much
higher. Yeah. And a few interesting things, I think, they're facing very similar challenges such as us around charging stations, range anxiety, and then overall the cost of, what they're facing in particular is the cost of insurance of EVs has gone up circa 20%, driven predominantly by batteries, the cost of batteries and to repair or replace. So we're seeing that's got a greater take-up rate, but the challenges are very, very similar to ours. And I think insurers are still working through how to price for that and that risk.
And this is very much another part of the market that has got a geopolitical exposure and risk to it. So in the United States, it's interesting, their ban on Chinese EVs and Chinese parts has very much meant that they are reliant on their own domestic or European production. They're not able to access cheap product, and for, probably likely good reasons geopolitically.
Yeah.
We understand all of that. But that all is having an impact on the consumer at the end of the day. Trying to do the right thing and buying an EV and then discovering that they pay a quarter more in insurance than everyone else, it will be a handbrake on all of that as well.
Absolutely. And we even heard that, depending on which government comes into office, very different views on trade agreements and tariffs in terms of imports. So that, I think, will only exacerbate the whole EV market or access to it in the US. which is very interesting.
While we're on motor, though, with AI, I think it is interesting, and home, the opportunities in innovation here and what it can do for the workforce, freeing people up from, certain roles and certain jobs and actually changing where you deploy them and the human capacity. I don't know if you had some thoughts or reflections on that.
Yeah, Andrew. I think it's very, very exciting, but it's one of those things that we've got to just be very careful not to get too carried away with it, because it is at that sort of peak of the hype cycle, and we haven't yet come down to the sort of trough of disillusionment, and that'll happen. But in the long term, it will make us all much more productive, and it will make us more efficient, and hopefully, if we can leverage that well, we can pass the reduction in our cost basis back to customers to make premiums more affordable. So I think that as much as we've talked about the sort of some of the tougher, more structural challenges, there's a lot to be excited about in working in this industry and leveraging these new technologies, driving innovation, sort of stimulating competition. I think those are all things that we can look forward to. But anytime you sort of weave AI in and cyber, you can also just see we had the CrowdStrike sort of shot across the bow as a sort of society. You can just imagine if those things aren't properly managed and properly governed and properly secured, just how bad things can actually turn out. So
that's right.
We must always look to capitalize on the upside, but you have to manage that sort of downside. Yeah.
I think the guardrails and the ethics around AI are really important, and also the driver as to why you would use AI in a way that has a mass impact, whether it be on your workforce. And so you've really got to think about the outcome or what the focus is. And if it's around, your time to resolve a claim for a positive customer experience, that becomes a very different parameters around why you're using AI and the ethics around it. So, but you're right, I don't think we've quite hit the trough on AI yet. There's still a lot of enthusiasm, certainly out of Silicon Valley. But there's also the augmentation of the workforce that I think as an industry and an employer, a big employer in Australia, we've got to seriously consider. So how do we augment our people and our workforce so that they are a lot more agile, both in terms of their capability, but also their capacity to adopt, absorb change and be able to respond to it with technology coming in.
And I think probably one of the other key messages that we heard in Silicon Valley was, and it's a message that gets delivered a lot, so my apologies to anyone from the enterprise networks online listening, is your legacy systems. There is, even at the meeting we had with the American Chamber of Commerce and Industry, there was that discussion around the fact of the huge shifts in the back-end infrastructure that has been happening over the last few years, the race into the cloud and now AI and the like, and how we keep up with all of that. And I think, that word of caution around not being left behind, but equally don't miss out on the opportunities you've got to be able to deliver a better customer experience and economies of scale. I think finally, what I get asked from everybody when they've finished asking polite questions about insurance is what's going to happen in the US with the election. It's we're joking at the time that it felt like we were on the set of Veep, and we literally were having meetings in the Eisenhower building above Kamala's office there, where, of course, the vice president is housed. What were your takeouts observing what's going on in the US?
So first of all, I don't think you could have scripted the timing any better or the sequence of events. It was literally, what are we going to wake up to today? Really interesting time, I think, for the US, extremely interesting. So we were there on the day where Biden announced he was going to step down, and Kamala Harris was his chosen, and then there was a process that went through. I think the US is grappling with some very significant issues, some of which align and transcend straight to Australia, and some of which are very specific and quite unique. I think the discussion and debate about abortion is a really big divider, and both parties have very, very different views. I think for us in Australia, trade and the treatment of tariffs is very important. Again, both parties have very different views. We know Trump has come out to say he will increase imports by at least 10%. And there's a moment for us to reflect on around what will this mean, if anything, for our AUKUS deal and for us as an economy and how we play. So that's a very, very important part for us. And immigration, I think, in the US is a point of difference from both parties. So we know that I think the Biden government currently has got legislation going through around a lot more proactive ways of bringing immigrants in lawfully into the country and addressing the issues around border. The Republicans and Trump have got a very, very different view. So very significant social issues with very different perspectives.
Very polarised.
Highly polarised.
Yeah,
highly
it's
polarised.
probably disturbing, actually, the level of polarisation now.
Yeah, and I don't think we could have been. I don't think it's possible to have been there at a point in which that those polar views could be more polar. Especially with, the attempted assassination attempt, which was
Forgot that one.
sort of just before that as well.
Yeah.
I mean, if memory serves me correctly, I think we were at Ambassador Rudd's residence the morning after Joe Biden
Yes.
said he's not going to run.
Yeah.
And it was just, you got to take all of these sort of macro things and distill it down. So practically, what's it going to mean for the Australia-US relationship? And we need, I think we all need sanity to prevail and for a little bit of the heat of the moment to be taken out.
I agree.
And
hopefully,
don't jump at shadows.
And a functioning democracy, generally sanity will prevail and we'll get onto a right footing. And I have to say, overall, though, the warmth in which the Australian delegation was received everywhere was exceptional. I think that they shared with us more than perhaps they would share with others. There was a genuine desire for cooperation. The work we've done on firefighting, for example, in California, and they come here and the like. There is a lot of linkages and I think a lot of desire for the two countries to remain close on working together. And I think that sort of soft diplomacy, a delegation like this, can drive outside the normal discussions around defence and all that are very important. So we do have some questions coming in. The first one is a good one, and I don't know the answer. I can't remember, but the question is, who updates US flood maps and what are the challenges? Remind me.
I recall that each of the counties is responsible for their own county's flood maps. There's a standard expected by FEMA. In order to be able to tap into the subsidized resilience investment, you need to get your flood maps up to that standard, which is so it's sort of a carrot and sort of a stick, which I think has actually been quite effective from what I took away from the conversations. That the flood maps are pretty good. They're at a relatively high standard, and they're relatively reflective of the risk.
So it puts good pressure on counties to ensure that the flood maps are accurate and are updated consistently to be able to participate in FEMA. I think that's a very interesting, proactive way of ensuring data's current.
Yes. Thank you for reminding me on that.
Yeah.
And I know that people like Alex Pearce on our delegation, on behalf of the ICA, because we spend our life pleading with local governments to give us flood maps to put into our own National Flood Information Database for members. That is something we did take away. Another question is around what is the future of the EV market in the next 3 years. I think it's probably among the things we touched on was the supply chains and the like, the take-up rates, the affordability issues. I think largely that was the extent of what we learnt. I don't know if we gleaned any hope other than we just need to send a lot more people to school to train them on repairing these things.
So I can talk about my personal view as an EV owner.
Yes.
The retail side has probably outpaced the ability for infrastructure to keep up. And I think that that retail demand will come back a little bit, which will just because
Hopefully
of
they'll
the
catch
pressure on the infrastructure, and then the infrastructure will catch up and reach a bit more of a point of equilibrium. I think that'll be sort of a 3 to 5 year type time frame. But I love my EV. It's my favorite vehicle we've ever owned.
They go fast.
It's just
They glide.
Yeah.
They glide.
They get you speeding tickets.
Yeah, well, so I suffer from range anxiety, so I've got a hybrid.
Yeah.
And also, where we travel just doesn't have the infrastructure to support an EV. So so we're in hybrid mode. But I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you, Nat.
And catch up. And it's really just as the infrastructure catches up, it'll become a bit more ubiquitous. There'll be a bit more of a because at the moment I think demand is outstripping supply for everything that you need for EVs. So and that'll competition will make that catch up, which will be good.
And we have to get a bit more sophisticated around where we place the infrastructure and how people access it. You know, in high urban places, how do people access it?
I'm also not sure that allowing that complete vertical integration by particular manufacturers is going to serve the broader community either in terms of economies of scale. But there are other big discussions that no doubt we'll be having with our friends in the smash repair business and commercial partners there. Now, we've got a question around whether we came across any instances of examples of insurers giving discounts for resilience work around homes and the like.
Do you want to?
Yeah, go. I mean,
so we did hear in California it was what did they call it? Build tough or tough plan or what was it?
They have the sort of resilience standards, and I think they're large. Some of them are federal, some of them are state-based, but each of those resilience standards is a consideration in the rate filings process. So I mean, I think there are several examples where there's a clear standard, and if a building is built to that standard, that
there are discounts,
reduction in the price.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's healthy because it drives the right customer behavior, and you benefit from the investments in resilience. So
that's still, I think, quite new though, in terms of its trial and impact.
I think State Farm had a product in California that had to be approved by the commissioner, but again, it was reflecting
exactly
home hardening.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think it was a key lesson that we were talking this week actually in Canberra about at a roundtable. With a bunch of federal independents, work by the Resilient Building Council here, which is verifiable and based on a lot of science and the like. It really enables insurers to be able to offer those discounts. So,
and I think it's getting that whole system to work because I think you can only get that certification once you've had somebody come past.
And back to the topic of cyber, what did we observe, I guess, in the question around what did we observe in terms of the offerings for cyber insurance in the market in the US?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the short answer was yes, there's capacity being put up against ensuring cyber risk.
Yeah.
I got a bit of a sense that there's maybe, I think there was a period of exuberance, and I think that's come back a little bit. But there is capacity on offer, and I think those who do a better job of managing their cyber risk exposure can probably source cheaper cover.
And benefit. I think it's matured in the US. I think the cyber pricing for cyber is certainly matured, and it sounds as though, I think from an industry perspective, it's quite a relatively stable product in terms of take up too.
I think that's absolutely right too.
I think the challenges they face in cyber are no different to the ones we do, which is how do you scope and define it?
Yeah, the gap of data is also another problem that we share with them. The lack of access to incidents, understanding what was going on. I think that was a direct conversation we had with the director in the White House building. There was around how we can encourage firms to be reporting, and then I think also that need to work with software providers and other key suppliers to businesses to do that backup question. So can I ask you both, if there was one thing that surprised you about the trip and one thing that you've taken away from the trip, what would they be?
Well,
I am surprised by just how complex the US insurance market is. It is so complex for the consumer. It is hard to navigate. It is difficult to understand. It's highly complex. The intent, there's been some positive attempts through regulation, which I think they haven't landed. They just haven't landed. But I didn't quite appreciate the extremity of the complexity of insurance in the US market.
Yeah.
That's one thing. I think my biggest takeout is, goodness, we're lucky to be in Australia. No, we really are.
Yeah,
in so many ways, in terms of the intent of the industry, the collaboration between ICA, industry, government, and I think the focus, and it's becoming sharper and sharper around risk mitigation and how do we effectively price for that. I think it's something that we just need to all pause and maybe it's something to be quite reflective and proud of.
Yeah.
I mean, that was exactly my sort of what I was grateful to take away is just how good this market actually is. But that also puts a big responsibility on us as the insurance market, is to keep meeting the ever increasing expectations of customers.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think we're well positioned, and I think we must just look after the good thing that we've got. And then maybe the closing thing for me was just the definition of insanity is repeating the same experiment, expecting a different result.
Yeah.
And we just can't keep banging our heads on the same wall. It's not productive.
Yeah, no, very good observations. Well, Christine and Nat, thank you for co-chairing and leading the delegation and all the time you gave for it, including this morning and sharing everything, sharing the lessons and learnings. This will repeat into the future. We will do other delegations, and I think it's a great opportunity for the industry to come together as much as anything else. Speaking of which, we have our ICA conference coming up in October.
Yes.
It is in Brisbane this year. We are down to just a handful of tickets left. So if you're interested in coming or your organisation wants to send a delegate along, please get in touch with the ICA. Have a look on our website. You'll see all the information there for the tickets. But we encourage you to come along and attend, and there'll be a lot of great takeouts from that conference. For this morning or for today, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate the support, again, we have from all of our members and all the work that we're doing across the board. I hope you have a great day at work. And for those people who watch this on playback, thank you for taking the time to watch this as well.